The calm before the storm. It was a serene Sunday afternoon in the quaint town of Pinewood, nestled deep in the heart of Mississippi. Pinewood was the kind of place where the world seemed to move a little slower, where neighbors greeted each other with nods and smiles, and where time appeared to stand still. However, beneath the surface of its picturesque streets and friendly facades, old tensions lingered, unspoken but ever-present. Nathaniel Nate Harris was a man of quiet strength. A former Marine with years of service under his belt, he carried himself with a dignity that turned heads, though he never sought attention. Now in his late 40s, Nate had traded the discipline of military life for a quieter existence, choosing to focus on family and the peaceful moments that life had to offer. His broad shoulders and chiseled features hinted at the strength and resilience he once wielded on the battlefield, but his gentle demeanor revealed the heart of a man who had seen enough of war. This particular Sunday found Nate driving his rusted but reliable truck along a winding, tree-lined road with his 8-year-old nephew, Jamal, by his side. The two had spent the day fishing at Mossy Creek, a hidden gem tucked away from the hustle of town. Jamal sat in the passenger seat, his small hands clutching a plastic container with their modest catch of the day, a single trout that he insisted they show Grandma when they got home. "You think Grandma's gonna fry it up tonight?" Jamal asked, his excitement infectious. Nate chuckled, glancing at his nephew. "If we tell her you caught it, she just might. She won't believe me if I say I did it." Jamal beamed, his small chest puffing with pride. The boy idolized Nate, and moments like these, simple, genuine, and full of joy, were what Nate lived for these days. The late afternoon sun bathed the road in hues of orange and gold, and the scent of pine trees filled the warm air through the open windows. As they passed the weathered sign marking Pinewood's town limits, Nate felt a familiar unease settle over him. It wasn't fear. He had faced far worse things in his life, but a sharp awareness, like a sixth sense honed from years of training. Something was off. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, and his chest tightened slightly as he spotted the flash of red and blue lights. Jamal turned in his seat, craning his neck to see behind them. "Uncle Nate, is that a police car?" "It is," Nate said calmly, his voice steady despite the tightening knot in his stomach. "Don't worry, buddy. We're just going to pull over and see what they need." He eased the truck onto the gravel shoulder, the tires crunching beneath the weight. He turned off the engine and kept his hands on the steering wheel, his movements deliberate and visible. Years of experience had taught him the importance of staying composed, even in situations like this. "Jamal, stay quiet and keep your seatbelt on," Nate instructed gently. The boy nodded, his wide eyes filled with both curiosity and unease. The patrol car stopped behind them, and 2 officers stepped out. Nate's sharp eyes assessed them immediately. One was tall and wiry, his gait predatory as he approached the truck, like a hunter circling prey. The other was stocky, with a swagger that suggested he enjoyed his position of authority a little too much. The stocky officer reached the driver's side window first. He leaned down, his mirrored sunglasses reflecting Nate's calm expression. "License and registration," he barked, his tone sharp and unfriendly. "Of course, officer," Nate replied evenly. He moved slowly, reaching for his wallet and the truck's paperwork from the glove compartment. His every movement was careful, deliberate. As he handed over the documents, the wiry officer circled to the passenger side, his eyes scanning the interior of the truck. "What's your hurry, huh?" He sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. "No hurry, sir," Nate replied. "Just heading home after a day of fishing." The stocky officer squinted at Nate's ID, a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Nathaniel Harris," he read aloud, as if testing the name. "You sure you're from around here, Harris?" Nate didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he met the officer's gaze, his expression neutral. "Yes, sir. Born and raised." The officers exchanged a glance, their smug expressions hinting that this was no routine stop. The wiry cop handed Nate's documents to his partner, and retreated to the patrol car, presumably to run a check. Nate knew this part well, the waiting game. It was a tactic designed to unnerve, to force the subject into impatience or mistakes. But Nate had learned patience the hard way, and he wasn't about to give them what they wanted. Jamal fidgeted in his seat, his small fingers gripping the container of fish. "Uncle Nate," he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "Are we in trouble?" Nate turned his head just enough to meet Jamal's worried eyes. "No, buddy," he said softly. "We're not in trouble. Just stay quiet and let me handle this." The stocky officer remained by the driver's side, his posture relaxed, but his tone condescending. "Got yourself a little passenger, huh? Cute kid." Nate's jaw tightened slightly, but he kept his voice calm. "That's my nephew." "Well, let's make sure everything's in order," the officer said, his tone laced with false courtesy. "Brake lights out. Did you know that?" Nate frowned but didn't argue. "It was working earlier today, sir. I'll check it when I get home." The officer's smirk widened. "Sure you will." The wiry cop returned, shaking his head. "Nothing on him," he said, almost disappointed. "Isn't that a surprise?" the stocky cop muttered. He tapped the roof of the truck, his smirk now replaced by a harder edge. "Step out of the vehicle." Nate's stomach tightened, but he complied, opening the door and stepping onto the gravel. He could feel Jamal's eyes on him, the boy's small frame stiff with fear. Nate had faced danger before, but this was different. This wasn't combat. It was a power play, and he knew the stakes were higher because Jamal was watching. "Hands on the hood," the wiry cop ordered. Nate obeyed, placing his hands on the sun-warmed surface of the truck. The officer began a pat-down, his movements unnecessarily rough. "You're awful quiet," the stocky cop taunted, leaning closer to Nate. "What's the matter? Got something to hide?" Nate turned his head slightly, his voice steady. "Just practicing restraint, officer." The response was met with a flicker of hesitation, a crack in the officer's facade. But the tension only escalated when the wiry cop opened the passenger door and gestured for Jamal to step out. "No," Nate said sharply, straightening up. His tone was firm, his body language commanding. "He's a child. He stays in the truck." The officers exchanged another glance, their smug expressions faltering. They hadn't expected resistance. Not like this. But Nate wasn't about to back down, not when Jamal's safety and dignity were on the line. The stage was set, and the storm brewing beneath the calm surface of Pinewood was about to break. A line drawn in the sand. The quiet stretch of Pinewood Road was no stranger to power plays. But this time, the air hung heavy with a different kind of tension. Nathaniel Harris stood tall, his calm demeanor masking the storm within as he squared off with the two officers who had pulled him over. His nephew, Jamal, was still inside the truck, his small hands gripping the edge of his seat, wide-eyed and trembling. Nathan's military instincts were on full alert. He knew this situation wasn't just about a so-called broken brake light. It was about control, authority, and most likely, an opportunity for these officers to flex their power on someone they thought wouldn't push back. Unfortunately for them, they had picked the wrong man. The stocky officer, whose badge read Murphy, stepped closer to Nathan, his smug expression hardening. "Step away from the truck," he barked, his tone sharp, almost daring Nathan to disobey. Nathan didn't move. His broad shoulders remained squared, and his hands stayed at his sides, deliberately unclenched. "Officer," he said, his voice calm but firm, "there's no need for this. My nephew is just a child. Let him stay where he is." Murphy's face twisted into a sneer. "You don't get to decide how this goes," he shot back, pointing a finger at Nathan. "You follow orders, or things get worse. That's simple." The wiry officer, whose name tag read Doyle, circled around to the passenger side again, his eyes narrowing at Jamal through the window. "Out. Now," he snapped, yanking the door open. Jamal froze, his small frame trembling as tears welled in his eyes. The boy looked at Nathan, his uncle, his hero, as if willing him to make it stop. Nathan's heart clenched. This wasn't just an abuse of power. It was a deliberate attempt to break him by targeting the one person he couldn't bear to see hurt. Nathan took a slow step toward Doyle, his movements deliberate and measured. His voice, though calm, carried a weight that silenced the officer mid-motion. "He's scared," Nathan said. "You don't need to frighten him any more than you already have." Murphy stepped forward, his hand resting on the butt of his holstered weapon. "Are you threatening an officer, Marine?" Nathan turned to him, his expression unreadable. "Not at all," he replied, his voice steady. "But I am asking you to think about what you're doing. You're escalating a situation that doesn't need to be escalated." Murphy's smirk returned, but it was less confident now, tinged with uncertainty. "Big words," he said mockingly. "You think being a Marine makes you untouchable." Nathan didn't respond immediately. He held Murphy's gaze, his silence more powerful than words. Then he said, "It taught me to protect those who can't protect themselves. That includes my nephew." Doyle reached for Jamal's arm, and that was when Nathan moved. It wasn't an act of aggression, but a display of control and discipline honed through years of training. He stepped between Doyle and the truck door, his stance blocking the officer from reaching the boy. "That's enough," Nathan said, his voice like steel. "He's staying in the truck." Doyle froze, his hand mid-reach, caught off guard by Nathan's sudden assertiveness. Murphy's hand hovered near his holster, and for a tense moment, it seemed like the situation could spiral out of control. "You don't want to do this," Nathan continued, his tone steady but firm. "Not with a child involved." Murphy laughed, but it was forced, the sound hollow. "Oh, I think you're the one who doesn't want to do this." The officer moved closer, his chest nearly brushing Nathan's as he tried to intimidate him. Nathan didn't flinch. Instead, he met Murphy's glare with an unwavering calm that seemed to rattle the officer more than any words could. Doyle, sensing his partner's faltering confidence, tried to regain control. "You think you're in charge here, tough guy. You're not. We are." Nathan's lips pressed into a thin line, his patience wearing thin. He glanced toward Jamal, who was now clutching Nathan's phone, his small hands shaking as he pointed it toward the unfolding scene. Nathan had shown him how to use it in case of emergencies, but he hadn't expected the boy to be so brave in the face of fear. "What's the kid doing?" Doyle snapped, spotting the phone. He lunged toward the truck again, but Nathan moved with the precision of a soldier who had faced worse threats than this. He stepped in front of Doyle, his body blocking the officer's path once more. "Recording," Nathan said plainly. "He's making sure there's a record of everything that happens here." Murphy's face turned red with anger, and his hand tightened on his holster. "You think you're clever, don't you?" Nathan's expression didn't change. "I think it's important to have the truth." The tension in the air was electric, the kind that made time feel as though it had slowed to a crawl. Doyle glanced at Murphy, uncertainty flickering across his face. "Murph, maybe we should." "Shut it," Murphy barked, his tone sharp and defensive. He turned his glare back to Nathan. "You think this little stunt is gonna save you? Think again." Nathan tilted his head slightly, his calm demeanor unnerving the officers more than any show of force could. "I don't need saving," he said simply. "But maybe you do." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and for a moment, neither officer spoke. Murphy's bravado cracked just slightly, the weight of the situation finally beginning to sink in. Doyle shifted uncomfortably, his hand hovering near his belt, but not quite reaching for anything. In the distance, the faint wail of sirens broke the silence, growing louder with each passing second. Murphy and Doyle exchanged a quick glance, their expressions betraying their growing unease. "Backup's on the way," Murphy muttered, as if trying to reassure himself. Nathan didn't move, didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his calm presence a stark contrast to the officer's increasingly frantic behavior. He knew the sirens weren't necessarily a good thing, but he also knew that the arrival of more officers might shift the balance of power. "Good," Nathan said finally, his voice steady. "Maybe they'll bring some accountability with them." Murphy's face darkened, and for a moment, it seemed like he might lash out. But the sound of the approaching patrol car forced him to hold back, his hand dropping from his holster as the reality of the situation began to sink in. Nathan glanced back at Jamal, who was still holding the phone with trembling hands. He gave the boy a small nod, a silent reassurance that everything would be okay. As the second patrol car pulled up, its lights flashing, Nathan took a deep breath. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for now, he had done what he needed to do. He had stood his ground, protected Jamal, and refused to be intimidated. The line had been drawn, and Nathan Harris was ready for whatever came next. The battle for truth. The second patrol car screeched to a halt, its flashing red and blue lights illuminating the tense standoff on the quiet stretch of Pinewood Road. The wailing sirens faded, replaced by the crunch of gravel under heavy boots as two younger officers emerged from the vehicle. The lead officer, a tall man with dark skin and sharp, watchful eyes, moved with purpose, while his partner, a shorter, wiry woman, followed closely, her hand resting near her radio. The two newcomers paused, taking in the scene before them. Nathan Harris stood with a calm but commanding presence near his truck, his nephew Jamal still inside, clutching a phone like a lifeline. The other two officers, Murphy and Doyle, looked rattled despite their attempts to mask it, their authority visibly shaken. The air was thick with tension, the kind that could either dissipate with words or explode with a single misstep. The lead officer approached first, his voice steady but firm. "What's going on here?" His tone carried the weight of someone who wasn't here to entertain nonsense. Murphy stepped forward, his bravado still faltering but present enough to bark a response. "Routine traffic stop. This guy's resisting orders." Nathan's gaze didn't waver as he met the lead officer's eyes. "That's not true, officer." He paused, glancing at the man's name tag. "Parker. I've complied with every lawful request. What's happening here is something else." Officer Parker's brows furrowed, his sharp gaze shifting between Nathan and Murphy. "Something else. Care to elaborate?" Before Nathan could respond, Doyle interjected, his voice defensive. "He's trying to play the victim. Got the kid recording us too." Officer Parker's attention turned to Jamal, who was still holding the phone with trembling hands. The boy's wide eyes met Parker's, a silent plea for help reflected in his gaze. "Recording?" Parker asked, his tone neutral but his expression curious. He turned back to Nathan. "Is that true?" Nathan nodded. "Yes, sir. My nephew started recording when they opened his door and tried to pull him out of the truck. I told him to stay inside, but they insisted on intimidating him." Murphy's face turned red, and he pointed a finger at Nathan. "Don't twist this." He was being uncooperative. "We were ensuring the safety of everyone involved." Parker raised a hand, silencing Murphy. "Enough." His voice carried authority, and for a moment, the only sound was the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. The female officer, whose name tag read Anderson, stepped closer to the truck, her eyes scanning Jamal and the phone in his hands. She crouched slightly to meet the boy's eye level, her voice softer than expected. "Hey there, kiddo. You okay?" Jamal nodded hesitantly but didn't speak. His small hands gripped the phone tightly, and he glanced nervously at Nathan. "It's okay," Nathan said gently, giving Jamal a reassuring look. "Show them what you recorded." Jamal hesitated for a moment before unlocking the phone and handing it to Officer Anderson. She stood and began reviewing the footage, her expression growing darker with each passing second. When she finished, she handed the phone to Parker without a word, her lips pressed into a tight line. Parker watched the video intently, his jaw tightening as he absorbed what had transpired. When he finally looked up, his eyes were hard, focused on Murphy and Doyle. "Care to explain this?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with an edge. Murphy's bluster faltered entirely. "It's not what it looks like," he stammered. "We were just following protocol." "Protocol," Parker repeated, his tone sharp. "Intimidating a child and escalating a situation unnecessarily is protocol." Doyle tried to interject, but Parker silenced him with a raised hand. "Enough. Both of you, step back." Murphy's mouth opened as if to protest, but the weight of Parker's authority stopped him. Reluctantly, he and Doyle retreated a few steps, their expressions a mix of anger and unease. Parker turned back to Nathan, his tone softening. "Mr. Harris, I'm sorry for what you've been put through tonight. Can you tell me everything that happened, from the beginning?" Nathan took a slow breath, his calm demeanor unwavering as he recounted the events. He described the fishing trip, the drive home, the sudden traffic stop, and the officers' attempts to intimidate both him and Jamal. He spoke with clarity, avoiding embellishments, his words precise and measured. As Nathan spoke, Anderson nodded along, her expression growing darker. When he finished, Parker glanced at his partner, and a silent understanding passed between them. "Murphy, Doyle," Parker said, his tone sharp. "Turn in your badges." Now, the two officers froze, their faces pale. Murphy's voice cracked as he protested. "You can't be serious. We were just doing our job." "Your job," Parker said coldly, "is to serve and protect, not abuse your power. What you've done here is unacceptable, and it will be dealt with." Doyle looked like he wanted to argue, but Anderson stepped forward, her eyes flashing with anger. "Do as he says." Now, grumbling under their breath, the two officers reluctantly removed their badges and handed them over. Parker took them without a word and turned back to Nathan. "We'll be filing a full report," Parker said, his tone apologetic, "and I'll personally make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug. What you've done tonight, standing your ground without escalating, shows incredible restraint. I'm sorry you had to endure this." Nathan nodded, his expression neutral. "I appreciate that, Officer Parker, but this isn't about me. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Parker's lips pressed into a thin line. "You're right, and I'll make sure it doesn't." As the patrol cars pulled away, leaving the gravel road quiet once more, Nathan turned to Jamal and opened the truck door. The boy threw himself into his uncle's arms, his small frame trembling with the release of all the tension he'd been holding in. "You were so brave," Nathan said softly, his voice filled with pride as he hugged his nephew tightly. "I'm so proud of you." Jamal pulled back, his tear-streaked face breaking into a small smile. "You weren't scared, Uncle Nate. Not even a little." Nathan smiled, though his eyes carried the weight of the day. "I was, buddy, but sometimes being brave means standing tall even when you're scared." As they climbed back into the truck and continued their drive home, the peaceful hum of the road returned. Nathan glanced at Jamal, who had fallen silent, the boy's small hands still clutching the now silent phone. The fight wasn't over, Nathan knew. But for now, he had protected his family and shown Jamal the importance of standing up for what was right. The road ahead would be long, but Nathan was ready to face it, one step at a time. The echo of justice. The quiet hum of the truck's engine was the only sound as Nathan Harris and his nephew Jamal drove through the winding roads of Pinewood. The adrenaline that had carried Nathan through the confrontation was ebbing, leaving a quiet heaviness in its wake. Beside him, Jamal sat silent, his small hands still clutching the phone that had recorded the incident. The boy's wide eyes stared out the window, his expression thoughtful and subdued. Nathan glanced at him, his voice calm and reassuring. "You did good back there, Jamal. I'm proud of you." Jamal turned to his uncle, his voice barely above a whisper. "Uncle Nate, are those officers going to come after us now?" The question hit Nathan like a punch to the gut. He reached over and placed a reassuring hand on Jamal's shoulder. "No, buddy. You don't have to worry about them anymore. What they did was wrong, and there are good people, like Officer Parker, who will make sure they're held accountable." Jamal nodded slowly, but the weight of the day's events lingered in his small frame. Nathan knew this wasn't just about fear, it was about understanding the world in a way no 8-year-old should have to. The truck rolled to a stop in front of Nathan's modest home, a single-story brick house surrounded by towering pines. As they stepped out, the familiar creak of the front porch greeted them, and the warm glow of the living room lights spilled into the dusk. Inside, Nathan's mother, Clara, was waiting. Her sharp eyes immediately locked onto her son and grandson, sensing something was amiss. "What happened?" Clara asked, her voice laced with concern as she took in Nathan's unusually tense posture. Nathan exchanged a glance with Jamal, silently weighing how much to reveal. "We had a run-in with a couple of officers on the way back," he said carefully. "But it's handled now." Clara's eyes narrowed, her hands finding her hips in that way that only mothers could manage. "Handled? What do you mean, handled?" "Nathan, if those men—" "They're not going to bother us," Nathan interrupted gently, but firmly. "Parker and Anderson took care of it. The situation's being reported." Clara wasn't convinced. She looked to Jamal, who had climbed onto the couch and was sitting quietly, staring at the floor. "Jamal, honey, are you okay?" The boy nodded but didn't lift his gaze. "Uncle Nate protected me," he said softly. "He didn't let them take me out of the truck." Clara's expression softened, but her worry deepened. She sat beside Jamal, pulling him into a hug. "Thank the Lord for that," she murmured before looking at Nathan again. "You did right by him, but you know this isn't the end of it." Nathan sighed, leaning against the doorway. "I know, Mama, but we got the recording. It'll make sure the truth comes out." Clara nodded, her expression both proud and resigned. "It better, because this town doesn't always do right by folks who look like us." The words hung heavy in the air, a truth Nathan knew all too well. He had grown up in Pinewood, experienced its subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, prejudices. Joining the Marines had been his escape, but now that he was back, it seemed some things hadn't changed. That evening, Nathan sat at the kitchen table, the faint glow of his laptop illuminating his face. The video Jamal had recorded was playing again, the audio crisp and undeniable. Nathan watched as the scene unfolded. The intimidation, the invasive search, the moment the officers tried to pull Jamal from the truck. His jaw tightened, and his hands balled into fists as the memories came rushing back. He knew the recording was powerful, but it wasn't enough to just hand it over to the local authorities. If Murphy and Doyle had been bold enough to abuse their power in broad daylight, Nathan couldn't trust that they wouldn't try to manipulate the system in their favor. He needed to ensure the truth reached as many people as possible. With a few clicks, Nathan uploaded the video to his social media account, attaching a detailed explanation of what had happened. He chose his words carefully, avoiding inflammatory language while emphasizing the abuse of power and the importance of accountability. As he hit post, a sense of purpose filled him. This wasn't just about his family. It was about exposing a system that had failed too many for too long. By morning, the post had gone viral. Nathan's phone buzzed incessantly with notifications as messages of support poured in from friends, former Marine comrades, and even strangers who had seen the video. The hashtags #JusticeForJamal and #StandWithNathan began trending, drawing national attention to the incident. Jamal was still asleep when Nathan stepped outside to retrieve the morning paper. The crisp air carried the scent of pine, but the tranquility of the moment was shattered by the sound of gravel crunching under tires. A black SUV pulled into the driveway, and Nathan's posture stiffened as two men in suits stepped out. "Mr. Harris," one of them called, holding up a badge. "I'm Special Agent Monroe with the FBI. This is my partner, Agent Carter. We'd like to talk to you about the incident involving Officers Murphy and Doyle." Nathan studied them for a moment, his sharp instincts evaluating their intentions. After a moment, he nodded and gestured toward the porch. "Let's talk." Over the next hour, Nathan recounted the events in detail, providing the agents with a copy of the video Jamal had recorded, Monroe and Carter listened intently, their expressions growing darker as Nathan spoke. "This isn't the first time we've received complaints about those two," Monroe admitted, his tone grim. "But this is the first time we've had concrete evidence. Your nephew's recording is going to make a big difference." Nathan's jaw tightened. What happens next? Monroe glanced at Carter before responding. "We'll be conducting a full investigation into their conduct, as well as looking into the department's handling of similar complaints. Based on what we've seen so far, this could go beyond just Murphy and Doyle. There may be a deeper issue within the precinct." Nathan nodded, though the weight of the situation pressed heavily on his shoulders. He had known this was bigger than just one traffic stop, but hearing it confirmed made the fight ahead seem even more daunting. As the agents prepared to leave, Carter turned to Nathan. "Mr. Harris, I just want to say, what you did out there, staying calm, standing your ground, that's not easy, especially with your nephew watching. It speaks volumes about your character." Nathan offered a small, tight smile. "I didn't have a choice. Jamal needed to see that you don't have to back down when you're in the right." Carter nodded. He saw, and so did the rest of the world. That night, Nathan sat on the couch with Jamal, flipping through the news channels. Every station seemed to be covering the story, with pundits and journalists debating the broader implications of what had happened. Nathan felt a strange mix of pride and unease. The attention was necessary to bring change, but it also painted a target on his back. Jamal looked up at his uncle, his voice quiet but filled with admiration. "Uncle Nate, does this mean they'll stop being mean to people like us?" Nathan sighed, placing a hand on Jamal's shoulder. "It means we've taken a step, buddy. A small one, but an important one. Change doesn't happen overnight, but if enough people stand up, it does happen." Jamal nodded, his small face lighting up with a hopeful smile. "I want to be brave like you when I grow up." Nathan smiled, pulling his nephew into a hug. "You already are, Jamal. You already are." The ripple effect. The world beyond Pinewood was stirring. News stations, social media platforms, and even prominent civil rights activists had latched onto the video Nathan Harris posted. It was no longer just a local matter. It had become a national conversation about justice, accountability, and the misuse of power. The names Nathan Harris and Jamal were now synonymous with courage, and Nathan's calm resolve in the face of injustice was being held up as an example of how to fight back without escalating violence. But with the growing attention came the inevitable backlash. Nathan sat in his living room, his laptop open on the coffee table, as he sifted through the endless stream of comments, messages, and emails. Most were supportive, but a disturbing number were laced with anger, disbelief, or outright threats. "You're a liar. Those officers were just doing their job. Stay in your lane, Marine." The words didn't faze Nathan. He had faced bullets, explosions, and far greater dangers than anonymous keyboard warriors. But the threats that mentioned Jamal, that was where his patience ended. "Uncle Nate." Jamal's small voice broke through the tense quiet. Nathan looked up to see his nephew standing at the doorway, clutching a stuffed animal. The boy's face was a mix of curiosity and concern. "Why are people mad at you? You didn't do anything wrong." Nathan sighed, shutting the laptop and beckoning Jamal to come closer. The boy climbed onto the couch beside him, looking up with wide eyes. "Sometimes, when people see the truth, it makes them uncomfortable," Nathan said gently. "It's easier for them to get mad at the person showing it than to admit something's wrong." Jamal frowned. "But we just showed what really happened." "That's right," Nathan said, resting a hand on Jamal's shoulder. "And because we showed it, a lot of people are listening now. Not just here in Pinewood, but everywhere." "Are they gonna fix it?" Jamal asked. Nathan hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "They're going to try. But change takes time, and sometimes people fight against it because they don't want things to be different." Jamal nodded, his young mind processing the complexity of it all. After a moment, he leaned against Nathan, his small body warm and trusting. I'm glad you're my uncle. Nathan smiled, pressing a kiss to Jamal's head. I'm glad you're my nephew. The following days were a whirlwind. Nathan's phone rang constantly with calls from reporters, lawyers, and community leaders. Offers for interviews poured in, along with requests to speak at rallies and town halls. Nathan wasn't interested in fame, but he recognized the importance of keeping the momentum going. If his story could shine a light on the deeper issues, then it was worth stepping into the spotlight. One of the calls came from a woman named Dr. Elaine Turner, a civil rights attorney with a reputation for taking on high-profile cases involving police misconduct. Her voice was calm but passionate as she explained her interest in representing Nathan and Jamal. I saw the video, Mr. Harris, she said. What happened to you and your nephew is part of a much larger problem, and I believe your case could set a powerful precedent. But I won't push you into anything. This has to be your decision. Nathan appreciated her straightforward approach. After a long conversation, he agreed to meet with her in person to discuss the next steps. 3 days later, Nathan and Jamal found themselves sitting in Dr. Turner's office, a sleek, modern space adorned with bookshelves and framed photographs of her past victories. Jamal sat quietly, his small hands gripping a notebook as he doodled, while Nathan listened intently as Dr. Turner laid out their options. We can pursue this on 2 fronts, she explained. First, there's the legal side. The officer's actions violated both your rights and Jamal's. We'll push for accountability, not just for Murphy and Doyle, but for the department as a whole. Nathan nodded. And the second? The second is public pressure, she said. Your video has already sparked a national conversation. If we keep that conversation going, we can push for broader reforms, better training, independent oversight, even changes to how complaints are handled. Nathan leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, let alone leading a movement. But when he glanced at Jamal, who was now carefully coloring a drawing of the fish they'd caught, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about him. It was about building a better future for his nephew and every child like him. I'm in, Nathan said firmly. Let's do this. The first rally took place in the heart of Pinewood, outside the courthouse where Murphy and Doyle had been summoned for a disciplinary hearing. Word had spread quickly, and by the time Nathan and Jamal arrived, the street was packed with people holding signs and chanting for justice. Nathan wasn't one for speeches, but as he stood before the crowd, microphone in hand, he found the words pouring out of him. This isn't just about one bad traffic stop, he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. It's about a system that allows abuse to go unchecked. It's about making sure that when someone puts on a badge, they understand it's not a license to intimidate, but a responsibility to protect. The crowd erupted in cheers, and Nathan felt a swell of determination. He wasn't just a Marine or a man standing up for his family anymore. He was part of something bigger. Back at home that evening, Nathan sat with Jamal on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The air was cool, and the sound of crickets filled the silence between them. Uncle Nate, Jamal said quietly, do you think those officers are sorry for what they did? Nathan thought about it for a moment before answering. I don't know, buddy. But I do know this. Whether they're sorry or not, they're going to have to face the consequences. And because of what you did, recording everything, they won't be able to hide from the truth. Jamal smiled, leaning against his uncle. I'm glad we caught that fish that day. Nathan chuckled, ruffling Jamal's hair. Me too, kid. Me too. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Nathan felt a sense of peace. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, he felt like they were moving in the right direction. The ripples they had started were spreading, and with every passing day, they were getting closer to the change they were fighting for. The fight for redemption. The courtroom was buzzing with tension as Nathan Harris sat quietly at the plaintiff's table, flanked by Dr. Elaine Turner and her legal team. The large chamber was filled to capacity, with reporters, Community members, and even activists from neighboring towns packed into every available seat. Jamal sat in the front row, just behind Nathan, his small frame dwarfed by the oversized wooden bench. He held his uncle's hand tightly, a quiet but powerful gesture of solidarity. The officers, Murphy and Doyle, sat across the aisle, their expressions carefully neutral, though Murphy's jaw twitched occasionally. Their defense attorney, a stout man with a booming voice, was already pacing, his every movement screaming confidence. But Nathan had faced worse opponents. He kept his gaze forward, his military discipline anchoring him in the moment. The presiding judge, an older woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, called the court to order. This is a hearing to determine whether the actions of Officers Murphy and Doyle during their interaction with Mr. Nathan Harris and his nephew constitute misconduct or abuse of power. Let's begin. Dr. Turner rose first, her movements graceful and deliberate. Your Honor, she began, her voice firm but calm. This case is about more than a broken brake light or a routine traffic stop. It's about abuse of authority, intimidation, and the systemic failure to protect those the law is meant to serve. She clicked a small remote, and a projector screen lit up with the video Jamal had recorded. The room fell silent as the footage played, the grainy audio capturing every word, every hostile gesture, every moment of escalation. Nathan watched the jurors' faces carefully. Their expressions shifted from neutral to tense, their eyes narrowing as Murphy and Doyle's actions were laid bare. When the video ended, Dr. Turner turned back to the courtroom. This recording, she said, gesturing to the screen, is not just evidence. It's a window into the fear and humiliation experienced by Mr. Harris and his 8-year-old nephew. These officers didn't act as protectors of the peace. They acted as bullies. The defense attorney stood, his booming voice filling the room. Your Honor, while the video is compelling, it's also incomplete. It doesn't capture the full context of the situation. Dr. Turner didn't flinch. And what context justifies pulling a child from a vehicle or attempting to intimidate an unarmed man who was fully compliant? The two lawyers sparred, their words sharp and calculated. Nathan remained still, his face calm but his fists clenched under the table. He knew this wasn't just about proving his own innocence. It was about showing the world what accountability looked like. By lunchtime, the courtroom had cleared for a brief recess. Outside, the courthouse steps were alive with energy as supporters chanted, held signs, and cheered for Nathan and Jamal. Nathan stood near the edge of the crowd, Jamal at his side, as reporters shoved microphones in his face. How do you feel about the trial so far, Mr. Harris? Do you think the officers will be convicted? What message do you hope this sends to law enforcement across the country? Nathan raised a hand, silencing the flood of questions. This isn't about me, he said, his voice steady. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what we did. It's about accountability and making our communities safer for everyone. If this trial helps move us closer to that, then it's worth it. The crowd erupted in applause, and Nathan gently guided Jamal back inside, shielding him from the chaos. Jamal looked up at his uncle, his small face filled with awe. You're really brave, Uncle Nate. Nathan smiled, resting a hand on Jamal's shoulder. I'm just doing what's right, buddy. That's what bravery is, standing up even when it's hard. The afternoon session brought testimony from witnesses and experts. Dr. Turner called a former officer to the stand, a man who had resigned from the Pinewood Police Department years earlier due to the same toxic culture that Murphy and Doyle exemplified. The department doesn't train for de-escalation, the witness explained. It trains for dominance. Officers are taught to assert control at all costs, even when it's unnecessary. Murphy's lawyer objected, but the damage was done. The jury's faces hardened, their growing disapproval clear. When it was Nathan's turn to testify, he walked to the stand with the same quiet strength he carried everywhere. Under Dr. Turner's guidance, he recounted the events of that day, the fishing trip, the joy on Jamal's face, and the sudden shift to fear when the flashing lights appeared. "I didn't speak up for myself that day," Nathan said, his voice steady, "because I've been trained to stay calm under pressure. But I spoke up for Jamal. He's just a kid. He shouldn't have to know what fear like that feels like." Dr. Turner nodded, her expression one of quiet pride. "And why do you think these officers behaved the way they did?" Nathan's gaze didn't waver. "Because they thought they could. Because they thought no one would hold them accountable." As the trial stretched into its second day, the courtroom was electric with anticipation. The final piece of evidence was a collection of complaints against Murphy and Doyle, unearthed by the FBI's investigation. Dozens of reports had been filed over the years, most of them dismissed or buried. The revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Murphy's lawyer scrambled to salvage his case, painting the officers as victims of a biased system and an overzealous public. But it was too late. The evidence was overwhelming, and the truth was clear. When the jury returned with their verdict, the room was silent. Nathan held Jamal's hand tightly as the foreperson stood, her voice steady as she read the decision. "On the charge of misconduct, we find the defendants guilty." A wave of relief washed over Nathan, though he kept his emotions in check. The fight wasn't over, but this was a victory, a step toward justice, not just for him and Jamal, but for the community as a whole. That evening, Nathan and Jamal returned home to find a crowd of neighbors waiting on their front lawn. There were cheers, hugs, and words of gratitude from people who had seen themselves in Nathan's fight. Clara, Nathan's mother, stood on the porch, her face glowing with pride. "You did good, son," she said, pulling him into a hug. "You stood up for all of us." Nathan smiled, his heart full as he looked around at the faces of those he had fought for. Jamal tugged on his sleeve, holding up a drawing he'd made of the two of them standing tall together. "Uncle Nate, can we hang this up?" Nathan crouched to Jamal's level, taking the drawing in his hands. "You bet we can, buddy. This is going on the fridge." As the crowd began to disperse, Nathan sat on the porch with Jamal, watching the stars emerge in the night sky. The fight for justice wasn't over. It never truly was. But for the first time, Nathan felt hope. Hope that they had sparked a change. Hope that Jamal would grow up in a world where fear didn't outweigh fairness. Jamal leaned against him, his voice soft but certain. "Uncle Nate, I want to be brave like you when I grow up." Nathan smiled, wrapping an arm around his nephew. "You already are, Jamal. You already are."